Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to continue our conversation with Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, just before the break, we were talking about the importance of standing up to some of the autocrats around the world. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the state of our own democracy. I know you have condemned the violence on January 6th, but in that book, Peril, Bob Woodward and Robert Costa reported detailed conversations you had with the president, Donald Trump, at that time on January 6th, and that you knew there was no congressional authority to overturn the election. Didn't indulging the doubters damage our democracy and our standing in the world?
Well, I haven't read that particular book, and I didn't happen to have any conversations with President Trump on January 6th. But
didn't you talk to him as they detail they detail a number of conversations you had in the book with the president?
I have no idea what that book says.
Challenging the election.
I have no idea what that book says, but I did not have any conversations with him on January 6th. But I also know what the Constitution provides. I had many conversations with him in days and weeks and months leading up to January 6th. I talked to the president sometimes as often as once a week or once a day. But my point is simple. Under the Constitution, Congress has a role and has a responsibility when it comes to certifying votes. And what I did, I brought together a group of 11 senators, and we objected to call for an electoral commission to review the claims of voter fraud and to assess and make a determination to consider the evidence. And there's a strong historical precedent for that.
Right.
If you look at 1876 and the election of 1876, there was a contested election. There were serious allegations of election fraud. And what Congress did in 1876 is it appointed an electoral commission.
Right, but
it consisted of 5 members of the Senate, 5 members of the House, 5 Supreme Court justices.
That what you're laying out as an intellectualized argument here is not what people gathered and chanting things like Mike Pence were talking about. You know that.
Look, I think the violence that happened on that day was horrific. I think any acts of violence, regardless of your political orientation, if you're right wing, left wing, or you have no ideology at all, if you commit an act of violence, if you assault a police officer, if you're violent against anyone, you should be prosecuted and go to jail. And that's what the law is. And so I absolutely condemned acts of violence. But what I did was led 11 senators in a constitutional option, which I think would have been much better for our democracy, because we right now have a substantial chunk of our country that has real doubts about the integrity of the election. And if we had had a credible electoral commission do an emergency audit, it would have enhanced faith in democracy. But instead, Democrats and a lot of the press decided to just engage in incendiary rhetoric rather than acknowledge voter fraud is real. It is a problem.
Well, do you have...
And the allegations of voter fraud needed to be examined on the merits.
Okay, Senator, there is no evidence of fraud that would have really drawn the outcome of the election into doubt. You know that. I want to ask you about 2024 and a race...
Voter fraud has been persistent from the very first election
Are you going to run for president in 2024? Would you challenge President Trump, or are you endorsing him?
Look, I have no idea what's going to happen in 2024. Donald Trump is going to have to make a choice, first of all, whether he's going to run or not. I think if he chose to run, he would be very, very formidable. I can tell you that when I ran in 2016, we came incredibly close. I came in second. There's a long history of runner-ups becoming the next nominee, and it was the most fun I've ever had in my life. But there's a lot of time between now and 2024. My focus right now is 2022, because I think next November is going to be a wave election, an awful lot like 2010 was. I think Republicans are going to retake the House, they're going to retake the Senate, and I am spending my time recruiting candidates, supporting candidates, and working to retire both Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer from their leadership positions, because I think the damage being done to this country, inflation, jobs being killed, open borders, weakness on foreign policy, I think Virginia and New Jersey were foreshadowing for what's coming November of next year.
All right, Senator. Sounds like a campaign slogan. All right, we will be right back. Like many Americans, we've been closely watching 2 trials related to race and the criminal justice system. Mark Strassman reports from Atlanta.
Kyle Rittenhouse, not guilty, sparked protests from New York.
All persons leave the area now.
to Portland, Oregon, which police there labeled a riot. But in the divided states of America, that verdict from Wisconsin means both redemption.
It's nice to know that when individuals take the stand to defend themselves, that the jury system in this country will recognize their right of self-defense.
And repudiation.
You can't tell me that these institutions are not sick. You cannot tell me that these institutions are not tainted with racism.
In the chaos of Kenosha last August, Rittenhouse, then 17, killed 2 men with his AR-15 style assault rifle. He claimed self-defense. Rittenhouse drove in from Illinois armed for battle. He knew outrage already ran high. 2 days earlier, a white cop had shot a black man 7 times in the back. The officer was never charged. Jacob Blake remains paralyzed from the waist down. Justin Blake, his uncle, angry about the Rittenhouse verdict.
We knew he wasn't going to jail for life, but we thought he'd go to jail and get spanked a little bit for his actions.
And he believes had Rittenhouse been black,
they'd have had him on the ground eating dirt or shot him dead on sight.
Lots to unpack here. This country's ongoing moment of racial reckoning, vigilantism, and self-defense claims from armed people who deputize themselves, and frustration with what many see as America's 2 systems of justice, separate and unequal. This murder trial of 3 men in Brunswick, Georgia, has all those issues.
This is a life or death situation, and I'm going to have to stop him from doing this, so I shot.
Ahmaud Arbery was jogging through a neighborhood. 3 white men suspected him of burglary. They chased him, cornered him like a rat, one of them said later. In a confrontation he initiated, Travis McMichael killed Arbery with his shotgun. McMichael also claimed self-defense, often tough cases for prosecutors. They grilled him on the stand. How was Arbery a threat?
Didn't pull out any guns.
No, ma'am.
Didn't pull out any knife.
No, ma'am.
He hasn't said one word to you.
He has not.
He's not threatened you in any way, verbally or physically.
No, ma'am.
The Arbery case has echoes of Trayvon Martin 9 years earlier. Both times, wannabe cops misidentified burglary suspects. Young black men shot dead. Gunman claims self-defense. No one's arrested for weeks. A jury later found George Zimmerman, Martin's killer, not guilty of murder. In that Georgia case, closing arguments will begin tomorrow. Only 1 black juror will hear them.
This court has found that there appears to be intentional discrimination in the panel.
That verdict, whatever it is, will fuel America's clashing definitions of justice and fairness.
That was Mark Strassman reporting. We go now to the head of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, who joins us from Jackson, Mississippi. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
So the jury accepted Kyle Rittenhouse's explanation that he was acting in self-defense. President Biden said, this was disappointing in some ways, but the jury system works and we have to abide by it. You say the verdict itself was dangerous.
It's hard for African Americans to reconcile what we witnessed in that trial. We have far too many individuals sitting in jail for crimes they didn't commit or overcharged for crimes that were committed. And here you have a 17-year-old who illegally purchased a gun, traveled across state lines to protect property that was not his for owners who did not invite him, and he put in harm's way based on the rhetoric that he's seen on social media platforms. So it's hard to reconcile the verdict with the experience that many African Americans have faced over the several decades. So this trial for us is a warning shot that vigilante justice is allowed in this country or in particular communities.
Kyle Rittenhouse, as you know, has become this sort of icon for some within the conservative movement. He was used back during the campaign by the then Biden campaign team in a campaign video that positioned him as a white supremacist. His mother said that was defamatory to him. The bottom line is this is being politicized. And I'm wondering what you think the impact of that is.
Well, the current political environment has allowed for this type of behavior. The prior administrations opened the door, and many individuals who operate under the banner of white supremacy have run through the door, whether it's Charlottesville or the killings in Pittsburgh at the synagogue or in Louisville. And unfortunately, until we have mature politicians willing to stand up, regardless of political affiliations, and address the questions of mob violence, vigilantism, but more importantly, the underlying issue of race in this country, something we have never truly addressed.
But there is no evidence of him being a white supremacist himself, correct?
Well, it's not about the evidence of him being a white supremacist. It is about the position that individuals like him find themselves in, where they think they have to go and protect property because of a peaceful protest, in some cases, of Black Lives Matter organizing. Black Lives Matter is a value proposition. It's not an organization in one sense. It's not about a hashtag. It's a value proposition that the lives of African Americans have been diminished and our lives matter. And when you have scenarios like what took place in Wisconsin that caused people to stand up with this police officer who paralyzed another innocent individual, you have to begin to ask ourselves for questions. Do we value the lives of not only African Americans, but everyone? And what he did was take up the mantle because the political climate allowed for him to do that. We had a white supremacist in the White House, and it opened the door to this floodgate of vigilante violence. And that's the real question here.
I want to ask you about a lawsuit that the NAACP has. You, along with Congressman Benny Thompson, are suing the former president and Rudy Giuliani, his personal attorney, along with some extremist groups, alleging that they violated the Ku Klux Klan Act by conspiring, I should say, with white supremacists to incite the violence at the Capitol on January 6th. As you watch what's happening in Charlottesville, how do you think that trial, if it has any connection at all, will influence your case?
Understanding the act was created after the Civil War had ended, and you had members of Congress pursuing a course to carry out their sworn duty. And anytime you have a disruption for members of Congress from carrying out their sworn duty, that's a disruption and a violation of the act. And that's what we sued on. Congressman Thompson had to step down as the lead plaintiff. Barbara Lee is now the lead plaintiff. But when you witness what took place on January 6th, it falls squarely on what the framers of the act intended, that members of Congress, Senate or House members, should not be under any threat of intimidation, violence that would prevent them from carrying out their duty. As we witnessed what's taking place. Go ahead.
Sorry, before I let you go, I want to quickly ask you about the current president. His approval rating among Black voters has dipped. 65% approve, 35% disapprove, according to our latest polling. Do you believe President Biden's living up to the promises he made to Black voters?
Still more work to do. I mean, he delivered on many promises, but the key thing for many of my members and people I talk to is voting right protection. And it's the time for the Senate to do their job, adopt voting right protections. The House have done their job. The Senate must do their job. The president must sign the bill. And I also believe that as we progress in this administration, that will be the true tell. We are within a year of the administration. A lot has been accomplished. There's still so much work to be done. But the number one issue is voting right protections for African Americans and for our democracy.
Okay, we'll watch those issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson, for your time. Don't go away. Here in the U.S., the number of COVID-19 cases continues to increase, up 20% in the last 2 weeks, but the situation is far worse in parts of Europe. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata reports from Poland.
The streets were ablaze as rioting erupted overnight in the Netherlands in a backlash against strict new COVID rules. A night after police fired on a demonstration in scenes the mayor called an orgy of violence. Tens of thousands protested in Austria, too, after the government there not only announced a new lockdown starting tomorrow, but ordered that vaccines would be compulsory by February 1st. The country has one of the lowest vaccination rates in Europe and one of the highest daily infection rates, per capita, 5 times worse than the United States. Europe has been racking up record numbers this week, a surge so worrying the World Health Organization warns of up to 500,000 more COVID deaths by the spring. In Germany, they're pulling down Christmas markets and considering a countrywide lockdown, too. Poland also recording the highest infection rates since April. In this ward, the only empty bed we found had been occupied by a woman who just died.
Europeans thought the darkest days of this nightmare pandemic were behind them, yet the COVID intensive care units are filling up once more. The difference is last time getting a vaccine was not an option. How many patients will survive? How many will die?
Generally, about 20% are surviving.
20% survive?
Yes.
None of them have been vaccinated?
Yes.
None?
None.
Spokesperson Katarzyna Malinowska said the numbers speak for themselves.
95% who are treated in intensive care are unvaccinated, and 99% who die is unvaccinated.
With the worst of the winter months ahead, health officials now face some tough decisions. Mandatory lockdowns, compulsory vaccinations, or follow Austria's lead and do both. Margaret?
Charlie D'Agata, thank you. We go now to former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who is on the board of Pfizer. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So 62 million Americans who are eligible to be vaccinated still aren't. And according to the CDC, 85% of the counties in this country are in substantial or high transmission. So you've already predicted a post-Thanksgiving spike. Is it too early in places like Washington, D.C. to lift mask requirements?
Look, I think local officials need to base the rules on what the local prevalence is. And right now, in some parts of the country, prevalence is very low. When you look at the South and the Southeast, even parts of the tri-state region, the Mid-Atlantic region, I think we need to be mindful that when we lift these restrictions, we may have to re-implement them if things worsen. Right now, we're better in this country than we were a year ago. There were 170,000 cases on a 7-day average. A year from now, a year ago from today, we had about 77,000 people hospitalized. So we're in a better circumstance, but we're probably not as good as we should be given all the tools we have between the vaccines and the highly effective drugs, and also how much infection we've had in this country and how much immunity is already in place.
Last Sunday, you told us it was one of the biggest missed opportunities for the administration to not have rolled out boosters and made them eligible for all earlier on. The CDC now has said all adults may get a booster shot and that those over age 50 should get a booster. Can you interpret that language for us?
Well, look, I think the reluctant nature by which CDC has been stepping into this debate reflects a broader ambivalence or a broader debate happening in the public health community about whether the vaccines should be used as tools to protect people from bad outcomes from COVID, or whether they should be used as tools to try to end the pandemic and control transmission. If you're recommending boosters for people 50 and over at this point, you're recommending a booster so that you can improve their immunity to protect them from a bad COVID outcome, because we see clear evidence of declining immune protection from the vaccines after 6 months. And that person's now at increased risk of having a severe case of COVID and having a bad outcome. If you're recommending boosters at this point for younger individuals, people who are 20, people who are in their teens, even 30s, in that case, there's a perception that you're recommending the booster not necessarily to protect that individual, because they probably still have pretty good immune protection from the first 2 doses, and they were at lower risk anyway, but you're recommending the booster as a tool to try to make them less likely to pass on the virus.
You've already seen governors in Connecticut and New Mexico say 3 doses is fully vaccinated. Should the CDC say you need a booster to be considered fully vaccinated?
I think at some point they're going to, but not this year. I think eventually this will be considered a 3-dose vaccine, but I would be hard-pressed to believe CDC is going to make that recommendation anytime soon, in part because of this debate about whether or not younger people who are at less risk should be receiving that third dose. In states where governors are looking to do this, and I think some local communities will do it, some businesses are probably going to do it quite soon. I think in cases where entities are going to mandate 3 doses for people who are 6 months out from the second dose, they're doing that because they're using the vaccine as a way to control transmission and try to end this pandemic. And there are people in the public health community who don't think that that's an inappropriate way to use the vaccine, but this is a debate that's going on right now in the public health community, and CDC's sort of stuttering approach to how they've embraced boosters is reflective of that debate.
The Labor Department's OSHA division said it's suspending enforcement of that Biden requirement to test or vaccinate business employees. We also saw Disney halt vaccine requirements in the state of Florida after the governor there said businesses can't carry out that kind of mandate. In both cases, you have the government telling businesses what to do. If you're a business owner, if you're an employee, I mean, what should you be doing right now?
Well, look, I think it's not inappropriate for businesses to mandate vaccines, and certain businesses absolutely should be mandating vaccination in their workplaces. Healthcare settings where you can't protect employees with other tools other than to make sure that you can keep the infection out of that setting. So settings where you have a lot of employees working very closely together, it's hard to work in a masked environment in perpetuity. I mean, this is the unfortunate consequence of government officials getting into these private decisions. If we ultimately left these decisions to mandate vaccines up to states, local districts, private businesses, I don't think you'd see this be a political fight at a national level. Now it's become a political fight at a national level, unfortunately. You're going to see some governors trying to position themselves on this issue, like you've seen in Florida. And you're going to see the federal government, the Biden administration, now fighting those states and fighting to implement these OSHA rules. The end result is that I think businesses that were going to move forward on mandates have moved forward, and businesses that are reluctant to do it are probably going to wait in place and see what happens with the outcome of this litigation involving OSHA. By the time this lawsuit ends up getting resolved, probably will be through the surge that we're seeing right now, this Delta surge, and maybe on the back end of the pandemic here.
Mm-hmm. But for people, it leaves a lot of confusion with them about what they actually can be expected to do and what they can expect of their coworkers when they walk into the office. Dr. Gottlieb, more to talk about with you, as always, but we got to leave it there today. Thank you for your time and have a good Thanksgiving. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. We want to wish you and your families a happy and healthy Thanksgiving, and we will see you next Sunday with a big interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Until then, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.